The issue of chemicals in the environment is a story about science, politics, and humanity's relationship with the planet. My name is Chris Hughes, independent scientist, and this is the Chemical Journeys podcast. Join me as we uncover the story of chemicals in the environment through conversations with individuals working in this space. So, let's get started. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Chemical Journeys podcast. Today I'm speaking with Anna Zhenova, who's the founder and CEO of Green Rose Chemistry, a company that helps clients to adopt safer and greener chemicals to create sustainable products and processes. Anna, thanks for joining me.
Okay, Chris, thanks for inviting me to join the podcast. It's a pleasure to be here.
No problem at all. I think I originally came across you. I was doing some work with Peter Fisk, and he mentioned that you were somebody that he had worked with and that I should get in contact with you. I think the first thing I did was Google your website, and I was really impressed with the way you'd laid out your website. I thought the artwork was really beautiful, and there's obviously a lot of passion coming through there in terms of the mission that you've got within your company. And it's also really nice to collaborate with somebody else who's in this world of solopreneurs. So yeah, it's great to have you on the podcast.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that's I really like the website myself, and I think graphic design is not often appreciated in the chemistry world. So it's nice to hear kind words about it.
No, definitely. It was really, really nice. Recommend anybody to go and take a look because it takes you on a little journey through the website. I think we could start perhaps by you telling us a bit in your own words about Green Rose Chemistry. You know, what kind of work are you doing? Who are the sort of customers that you're serving?
Yeah, sure. So we are a very small consultancy, but we do a lot of different work, actually. I sort of disregard the advice to focus narrowly that's often given to chemistry consultants, because I personally like learning something new all the time, every day if I can. While we do specialize in green chemistry, the principles of green chemistry are broadly applicable across basically every sector, every type of chemical manufacturing, chemical use, and chemical distribution. So we work with a really wide range of sectors and projects. I always say we're a mission pyramid consultancy. So we aim to accelerate the sustainable chemical transition by lending our expertise to other companies that need them. And that takes a couple of different forms. One is the technical side of things. So we provide technical R&D services in green chemistry. And the other is the communication side of things. So that covers development of marketing content, advice on opportunities and technology landscaping, and then also training courses is our most recent offering. So we've done training courses on demand a few times in the past, going back to 2022, so almost 4 years now. And it's gone really, really well. So we now this year have taken on a consultant who actually has a background in education, and she's fantastic. So she's helping us to spin it out into a proper offering where we say, okay, we do offer training courses, and we publicize that as part of our services now. So we're already in quite a few discussions after having started to publicize that a couple months back.
No, that's awesome. I think the education side is such a big part of this overall sustainability movement, isn't it? Because people need to retool, right?
Yeah,
in terms of
absolutely. And
how to approach things.
There's a wonderful nonprofit in the US called Beyond Benign, and they are trying very hard to get green chemistry across the board into education, from primary school all the way through to university commitments to integrate green chemistry into their programs. That's run by Amy Cannon, and she's doing a fantastic job. But the problem that I've noticed is the professionals who are already in the industry might care very much about sustainability. They might have a lot of expertise in formulations or extraction, but getting the green chemistry expertise in order to take their company and make it greener, that is really challenging once they're already in the industry. You know, if you don't want to go back to get a master's or to get a PhD, there's not a lot of options out there. So that's the gap we're trying to fill, because we don't have much time left to make that transition happen. And we can't wait until the next generation of chemists comes into the workforce. The chemists who are in the workforce now to understand the principles of green chemistry and be able to practically apply them and understand what a life cycle assessment is and why that matters for chemistry, and to understand about environmental justice and the intersection of chemistry and environmental justice and how their work is contributing to that. So we really need to retrain the chemists who are already out there, the ones who care and are convinced it's something that's worth doing, but just don't have the skills to actually do it themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a really important role that an organization like yours, like Green Rose Chemistry, can play in terms of getting this knowledge distributed throughout the economy, right? Because that's the challenge, is it's difficult to do this in a sort of top-down manner. It kind of has
Well,
to, you
exactly.
kind of have to do it through conversations.
Yeah, and that's the hope is, we are a small consultancy, and initially I thought, oh, I'll grow the consultancy and we'll become really big, and then we'll end up providing help to dozens or hundreds of companies at any time. But even that, even if you imagine my company suddenly tomorrow had 50 employees, that still wouldn't be enough to meet the demand for green chemistry, even in the EU, much less around the world. And so I've realized that actually those kinds of training programs, which I think we're uniquely positioned to deliver because we have a really good combination of technical expertise and communications expertise, those sorts of courses are actually going to be more impactful if they can embed those skills directly within the companies. A, it's more consistent. B, they have a better understanding of the company's needs. And C, the company spends less money on green chemistry consultancy, so they're more likely to actually do green chemistry because that
Mm.
cost barrier can be hard to get over for a lot of companies.
Yes, and they need to sort of integrate it as part of their DNA, right? Rather than
Mm.
it just being something that you purchase from a consultant, like
That's
you say.
exactly right, because a lot of the times when we do projects, they're not, well, some of the time when we do an R&D project for a company, it then isn't taken forward for whatever reason. Either priorities change or the employee that really believed that that project was necessary leaves the company and nobody takes it forward. There's a lot of reasons that these sorts of reports get dropped after they're commissioned. And that's, it's heartbreaking for a mission-driven consultancy when we're trying to make an impact. So actually transferring those skills to chemists who are in the industry and to not just chemists, but sustainability professionals who need to understand a little bit about chemistry, to toxicologists who need to know more about process engineering, doing that sort of interdisciplinary skills transfer, I think it's really powerful.
Yes, it sounds like, in a way, within companies, you need an advocate, and you find it that's kind of on the ground level, let's say, or do you typically see how you engage with companies? Is it higher up and then they're looking to get these things implemented in their day-to-day processes, or do you find that you need to work with people who are perhaps at the coalface and want to bring these concepts and these processes into the company?
I mean, I think ultimately it has to be both, right? You
Yeah.
need the sort of full-face chemists, the ones who are making the decisions about choosing a solvent, choosing a reagent, trying out this, trying out that. They need to be equipped with the tools to make those choices in a green way. But you also need support from the very top, because if you have managers or VPs or CEOs asking, well, why did you spend, 10p more per liter on a greener solvent? That's not consistent with our cost saving initiative. Then, like, even the chemist who cares and is equipped with the tools is not going to get anywhere in the end. So it has to align throughout the company, all the way from the top
Yes.
down through the chemists who are doing the actual work. But we most often work with somebody kind of in between. It'll be like an R&D manager or a formulation director or something like that, where they have enough decision-making ability, they have enough clout within the company to push
Mm.
and say, okay, we actually need to spend some money on this. They need to reskill our chemists, we need to reskill our biologists, etc. So yeah, it'll often be somebody like that who has a higher level title, but has seen the light themselves. We're not actually, right now, we're not in the business of trying to convince companies that they should be doing green chemistry, because there's
Mm.
already enough companies out there that understand that they need to do it, but just don't know how. So that's kind of our sweet spot. That's our working space right now, is companies who have seen the light, but don't have the expertise in order to act on it.
No, that's really interesting. Yeah, because that helps to describe the landscape where we are, and different companies are at different stages. I imagine different sectors are in different stages of maturation
Oh,
in terms of
absolutely.
adopting these principles.
Yeah, there's a huge sectoral difference, and some sectors are already so deep in that space that we don't even have anything to teach them, right? Well, not sector wide, but in general, as a rule, sectors where vulnerable populations are more affected. So, like baby skin care, right? Anything that goes on a baby's
Hmm.
skin. Parents care a lot about that being absolutely safe and as sustainable as possible. So that's a leading sector, right? Cosmetics and personal care in general. They already have this focus on natural, bio-derived, plant-based ingredients
Hmm.
because the customers who buy those products, they have feelings about those words, right? And that's actually a really interesting thing. Is I know you work a lot with hazard and safer chemistry. I do that,
Yeah.
but I also work with renewable chemistry and bio-based chemistry. So making chemistry not from fossil sources, not mining it up out of the ground in an environmentally destructive way, but ideally growing it in some way that locks carbon down and then using that to make bio-based chemicals. So the interesting thing about the bio-based chemical space is nobody feels any feelings about the word bio-based. Like
Yeah.
it's too technical, and yet it's the word that most of the bio-based chemical industry is using. So the cosmetics industry and the personal care industry have really stolen a march on other sectors by saying our ingredients are natural or our ingredients are plant-based instead of bio-based, because that
Hmm.
gets an emotional response from the customers that they need to care that these things are natural. So yeah, they've done quite well with that. But then companies like, let's say, the automotive sector or the defense sector, right? These are companies that are now starting to understand that this is really a problem for them, but they have had other priorities up until now, right? Like the automotive sector, they've been very focused on better fuels and more lightweight vehicles because that is where the bulk of their climate impact is happening. If the vehicles are
Hmm.
lighter, then you don't have to move as much weight, which means you save a lot of energy. There were a lot of savings to be had there, so they've done that. And if you use bio-based fuel, if you use alternative fuels or you switch to even electric vehicles, you open up the opportunity for renewables to be in that sector, and that makes a huge impact. But now they've kind of, they've made huge inroads, huge steps in that direction. And now we're starting to see a demand from automotive for, okay, well, what about the foam that's inside of the car seats that we're still getting from a petroleum feedstock? How do we make that bio-based while keeping the car safe? In the event of an accident, you don't want that foam to catch on fire. How do you do it using bio-based chemistries? How do you do it at the scale that the automotive industry needs? In cosmetics and in personal care, it's very easy to have a boutique brand, right? You can have tiny little bottles that are being sold in a pack of 100 to the local organic shop, and you can build a business that way, but you can't sell just 2 cars. It doesn't really work. So yeah, the scale of adoption for something like the automotive industry makes it much harder to change the materials that are going into that industry.
Yes, and it is a still quite a nascent sector, isn't it? The bio-based sector, but it does seem that there's huge potential there, right? I
Yep.
mean, you've given an example there around the foam in seats, and I guess it's an iterative process, isn't it? We're going to need to kind of solve for many, many problems individually, and
Yeah.
each one is going to take time.
Yep. And there's often sort of knock-on effects or synergies in between the different individual parts, right? So if you look at baby car seats, that's actually a pretty good example because the foam in infant car seats was impregnated with flame retardants and they're not chemically linked to the foam. They're just you take the foam and you essentially dip it in a flame retardant bath and then you let it dry. So those flame retardants come out in the dust. They come out every time you put your infant in the car seat. And we're now starting to understand that in the last 15 to 20 years, we've gained a lot of understanding of what happens to those additives, to foams, to furniture foams. What we've realized is they get into your bloodstream. So parents now have this realization that they actually don't want to put their child in a car seat that's full of non-chemically bonded flame retardants because that is bad for the baby. a company in the US figured out that instead of soaking the foam in flame retardants, they could actually use a cover for the car seat. So the fabric that they covered the foam with was inherently flame retardant. And that meant that they could remove all of the chemical flame retardants in the foam. And so they came to market and said, we have the first flame retardant free car seat. And they sold out. Their first production run basically immediately sold out. So it's interesting because you think, I need to replace the foam in the car seat, or I need to replace the flame retardant. I need to do something about the flammable bit. But actually, you can have a more systemic solution where you prevent the flame from reaching the flammable component, and then it's just as safe. So there's this concept in greener chemistry of substitution, not of the chemical, but of the function of that chemical. And that's called functional substitution, which is a term that Jill Tickner in the US came up with, I think in 2014 was when he published that paper. And it's really caught on since then. So now, even in Europe, people are talking about functional substitution and substituting the thing that that chemical is doing rather than substituting the chemical itself.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point, is that a lot of these chemicals that we're using are delivering functions. When we're looking to perhaps substitute a chemical that we determine to be undesirable, we can look beyond replacing it directly with another chemical, but actually redesigning the solution. And I suppose one thing that I've, in my sort of experience working with chemicals and hazard and risk assessment of chemicals, I always found there was a disconnect there with product development. And when we talked about we need to drive towards safer, more sustainable chemicals, that understanding of the technical performance was always seemed to be a gap that was difficult to sort of bridge. I mean, are you seeing progress being made there? Do you have any experiences of connecting people to have more of those discussions between chemical risks and performance?
Not really. It's very much something that needs to be done. And this is something that I've noticed in my own work is when we come into a company and start figuring out how to substitute a chemical with a greener one, we need to make sure that every relevant team is represented in the room. And then not only are those teams in the room, but they have to be able to communicate with each other. Oftentimes, the language that they use is inherently different. So you have your ESG folks, your sustainability team, who are there talking about carbon footprint. And then you have your toxicologists who are talking about the inherent hazard of the chemical. And then you have your risk assessors who are talking about not the hazard, but we need to look at the risk and how can we control the risk. And then you have your formulations or your product design team who are talking about the performance. If you're lucky, you have the marketing team in the room as well, because they're there to talk about how they're going to sell this thing to the customers. And maybe you even have your sales team and they're reporting back on like, what is it that customers are asking about? Do they care if something is Teflon free, or do they just want it to perform? So if you have all of those teams in the room, which is rare, it's rare to even get full-on company commitment. So you can get every relevant department to send a representative. But even if you do get them all in the room, they're speaking completely different languages. So a lot of what we do is actually that sort of alignment of trying to get people to communicate with each other in a helpful way, staying in there. And we try to do it in quite a systematic way whenever we do an alternative assessment. We ask people we start by asking in sort of a very chemically technical language, right? We say like, what's the viscosity of this solvent, the boiling point, the auto ignition temperature that you guys can't go above. But we very quickly tailor it to who's in the room, right? So usually we will have at least one chemist who understands most of those terms, but oftentimes they'll just say, we just need it to be non-flammable, and I'm not really sure about the exact auto ignition temperature. And we say, okay, that's fine. Can you just give us like in your own words, tell us what it is that you need, and then we will use our judgment to come up with a number that fits that. So a lot of that translation work is really critical to get the alignment that you need in order to do a good alternatives assessment and to do good substitution work. Because otherwise you might think you understand what it is that the company needs, and you come back with a solution, and actually they say, no, that doesn't suit us at all. Weren't you listening? to what we said. And we've even
Mm-hmm.
had cases where we come back with a solution that the company didn't realize that they wanted, which sounds a little bit ridiculous, but companies will sometimes have this laser focus, this tunnel vision on one thing. And sometimes it's cost, sometimes it's performance, sometimes it's carbon impact, right? It'll be the CO2 emissions. And they lose sight of the bigger picture. So we've had some interesting cases. There's one in particular where the customer was dead focused on cost. They were looking for an alternative solvent for them. And the one that they were thinking that they had initially wanted to use was toluene, which is very, very cheap, but also very, very nasty. It has a lot of hazards, including aquatic toxicity, flammability. It's very volatile, so it escapes into the air immediately if it's released. They were basically saying if we can't find us something that's roughly as cheap as toluene, then we're not going to be able to use it. So I went and tried to find them something that was as cheap as toluene, but didn't have the flammability hazard, which was their main concern for insurance reasons. If there was something like that on the market, they would have already been using it, and they wouldn't have had to come to me because it would have been an easy choice. Normally, by the time a company comes to me, they've already explored the easy choices and they're kind of at a loss and they need help deciding about trade-offs rather than making an easy choice. So this company, they were very, very convinced that it needed to be cheap and it needed to be basically the same performance as toluene and it needed to just not have that flammability hazard. I eventually came back with a solvent that cost 10 times as much as toluene and performed much slower. So it would do their cleaning process in, say, 24 hours instead of 10 minutes. But the company in the end was actually 100% happy with that. They were thrilled with that solution, even though it's the polar opposite of everything that they said they wanted. Because when we zoomed out and looked at the bigger system, and we actually pulled in a risk assessment consultancy to do this because we needed somebody that is well practiced in doing systematic assessment and costing of risk. When we pulled in that risk assessment consultancy and went through two scenarios of using toluene or something similar, or using the safe solvent, they actually found that in the long run, or even in the immediate term, the safer solvent was cheaper because they would have to spend 10 times as much to buy the 1 ton of solvent, but they wouldn't have to replace it very often. And the controls that they would have to use were so much lower for the safe solvent. They could have a tank of it inside their manufacturing facility, move the tools to be cleaned directly to the tank, move them back. Even if it took a full day to clean the tools, they would still have them on site. They would know exactly where they are. They would know when they would be cleaned because inside the building it's fairly climate controlled. And then the other scenario was toluene would have to be external to the building. So they would essentially have to build a satellite site on their manufacturing site. It would have to be across a car park from their main building. So they would have to train their employees to safely forklift their very expensive machined aluminum tools across the car park without hitting anybody. They would have to have not just a secondary control, but a tertiary control in case of release because toluene was so hazardous and the site was next to a river. So if anything went down the drain, it would drain directly into the river. And toluene has high aquatic toxicity. There was a house right next door. There was a residential site. So it would have been really bad PR if their neighbors suddenly started smelling toluene and were exposed to it. So it would have had to have multiple levels of containment. It would have had to have 24-hour monitoring in case it spilled, volatile solvent pumps, which are very expensive. They wouldn't have been able to put a heating jacket on the thing safely because of the flammability. It was just cost after cost after cost. The choice was so obvious that the safer solvent was it was cheaper. It was 10 times the price and it was cheaper. And so they went with that. And now they're building that system out. And I just really like that study because they had gotten so laser focused on the cost of the solvent that it took zooming out systematically to convince them that actually safer is cheaper in this case and in many cases.
No, that's a really good story of a win-win with improving the safety of the solution and also in the end it's better for the business as well. That's great. I've realized we didn't really invite you to sort of describe what green chemistry is, but I think with our discussion so far you've sort of painted a picture of that it's actually many different spokes in a wheel, isn't it? And
Yeah,
there's
yeah.
lots of different things to take into account.
There's parts of green chemistry that are actually already integrated into traditional chemical engineering. Efficiency is part of green chemistry because you don't want to waste resources. And efficiency is also part of traditional chemical engineering because you don't want to waste money. So the motivations are different, but in terms of actual actions that you take, they're very much the same, right? You try to reduce waste. If you can get value out of a waste product, you try to do that. You try to sell it on to somebody else who can use it. That's all green chemistry, and it's also standard process engineering. But there's other bits that are not standard, right? So you have your efficiency, and then there's safety, which is part of traditional chemical engineering because you try to minimize risk. So you control hazard as much as you can. You put people in protective equipment, you non-ignition type equipment, right? That doesn't have open flames or sparks, things like that. So yeah, safety is in there, but green chemistry takes an approach of eliminating hazard rather than risk. When you do green chemistry, there's a contrast to traditional process engineering where you don't accept that hazard is inevitable. You don't say, okay, well, doing chemistry is just dangerous, so we just have to deal with that as best we can. With green chemistry, you say, why is it hazardous? Does it actually need to be hazardous, or is there a safer way that we can do this? Are we maybe looking at the system costs wrong? Maybe we don't need to have a flammable solvent. Maybe it's actually cheaper to have the safer solvent when you zoom out and look at the whole system. And that's something where if you keep zooming out and out and out, that's where the environmental justice bit comes in, is because the cost of pollution or chemical hazard are often pushed outside of the factory and they're not accounted for, right? So you have communities who are exposed to chemicals that affect them in a very real way and create serious health problems. And the cost of those problems, to talk about it in cold financial terms, the cost of those problems is real and it's passed on to society. It's lost productivity, right? It's mental health challenges. It's actual medical costs for treating cancer and treating other conditions that come from hazardous chemicals. So that's where green chemistry, I think, diverges quite significantly from traditional chemistry and traditional chemical engineering, is we don't accept that hazard is inevitable. We say, can we do this in a safer way? Because somewhere in the system, even if it's not inside your factory or inside the final product, somewhere in the system, that hazard is going to have an effect and it's going to have an impact and a cost. So that's the second pillar. So there's 12 principles of green chemistry, but I like to split them up into 3 pillars. That's much easier to remember. So efficiency, safety, inherent safety. The third one is renewable feedstock. And that's something that's not at all present in traditional chemistry because traditional chemistry doesn't think at all about where the chemical is coming from. But the feedstock or the raw material for the chemical, we want that to be good for the environment when we do green chemistry. So we've talked a lot about bio-based stuff, but it's not just bio-based. It can be from CO2, right? So pulling CO2 from industrial flue gases and then reusing that and locking it away into chemicals. There's also examples like just using waste feedstocks, right? So if you can't go bio-based because you're talking about an inorganic chemical like a metal or a mineral, how can you do that in a renewable way? How can you do that in a circular economy? And the answer is usually you find waste from another process and repurpose that. So that's also a type of not strictly renewable, but at least circular feedstock. And then, recycling is the last big one. Is we're going to have to find better ways to recycle plastic and other chemicals in order to continue to gain value out of them and move them back into the economy instead of throwing them away.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you. That's a really nice overview of green chemistry, and you've actually covered a lot of the different facets of it there, including the sort of environmental justice externalities component, which, you're right, we're not accounting for a lot of the potential externalities or the impacts from some of these activities, at the moment. And do you have any thoughts on how those could be better addressed?
I mean, if you start to think about it for too long, it becomes very clearly a moral question, right? Or I guess that's not thinking about it for too long, or thinking about it for the correct amount of time. And at that point, it becomes a moral question rather than an economic one. And I've actually been doing more and more reading about economics lately because that's what it always comes back to, right? People are saying that the cost benefit analysis that would make sense. And if we were to stop using this hazardous chemical to protect, a frog or a small community outside the factory, then the cost of that, we wouldn't be able to make medicine that saves hundreds of thousands of lives, or we wouldn't be able to have non-stick pans. But eventually, all economics comes down to sort of a moral judgment, doesn't it? You have to weigh up one cost against another cost and say, okay, which cost is worth more? Is it one human life, or is it 1 million eggs that come off the pan easier? Right? So somebody has to make that decision at some point. And I'm starting to read more and more about different economic models because the dominant economic model right now, I would say, is not a particularly ethical one. It doesn't spend a lot of time thinking about what are the philosophical implications, what are the ethical and moral implications of these cost decisions that we make. And actually, that's fairly recent. If you go back a couple hundred years, economists were kind of philosophers. They've spent a lot of time thinking and talking about what does it mean to cost a human life, right? What are the implications of all of these cost-based decisions that we're making? And somewhere along the way, that's fallen out of traditional Western economics. So it's something that I'm still like, I don't even have the vocabulary to talk about it because I'm very much trained as a scientist and as a chemist and not as an economist, but I'm starting to read more and more economic texts and try and figure out what my opinion on this is. Because that's what it comes down to. And I've started playing a little game with myself where I go to green chemistry or, bioeconomy type conferences and I time how long it is before I first hear, well, capitalism is the problem, isn't it? And that amount of time has been decreasing. And I think the record it was about maybe 3.5 minutes into a conference before somebody was like, well, really capitalism, isn't it? That's solving all of these problems. And it is, right? Unfettered capitalism is what's telling us that we can have externalities that happen to somebody else somewhere else in the world, and it doesn't matter as long as we get our shampoo, as long as we get our vinyl floors, right? So there's something very, very wrong with the economic system, and I don't think there's an easy fix. But yeah, this has maybe gone deeper than you intended, so sorry for going down that rabbit hole.
No, you're okay. We never know where these conversations are going to go. And yeah, I mean, it is really interesting, the points that you raise. I've been thinking myself about some of these things. The more work I've done on the issue of chemicals in the environment, the more philosophical questions it seems to raise. I think one thing's for sure, we've built a society on the basis of the system, and there have been a lot of benefits to the society that we have. But there are also some things to be concerned about. Then it becomes a question of, well, how can we begin to address that? If I can zoom in on the topic of environmental persistence, because I've been thinking about this quite a bit, because I do feel that this is kind of like a trigger point for some of these issues. For a long time, we've performed risk assessments of chemicals with an assumption of a steady state concentration in the environment, and that we can kind of calculate that, and then we can feel pretty assured that the risks will be controlled because of that. And then you see more recently people talking about issues like microplastic pollution and PFAS, where there's this extremely long residence time in the environment for these kinds of materials. I'm seeing that is something that's challenging some of our paradigms, but in the end it comes down to, are we okay with there being chemicals in the environment? That's another point, which I think that the scientists that perform these risk assessments were generally okay with it, and they kind of gave a pass to allow the economy to develop in this way, but the public was not informed about it. And so now that we see a lot of alarm in the media about chemicals, new chemical issues that we sort of learn about, the public is getting continuously bombarded with this information, and they're frightened. And as a result of that, we're getting quite reactionary responses in terms of policy. And I think we do need to have a grown-up conversation about how we've got to where we are and what we can do thereafter to try to address some of these things and really properly decide what we want to do next.
Yeah, I mean, In a sense, yes, somebody has decided that it's okay to release these chemicals into the environment. But in another sense, a lot of the chemicals that are in the environment were never approved for release. Or if they were approved, it was without any significant data about their hazards. And I heard an interesting talk at the conference I was at in the US. It was the American Chemical Society's Chemistry and Engineering Conference. And it happens every year, and I try to attend when it's convenient because there's really interesting insights that are shared there. But this was an environmental toxicologist who was talking, and she says, I get phone calls from environmental chemists, and they've discovered a chemical in the environment. So if they've gone out and sampled a stream, or they've gone out and sampled the soil, and they found a new chemical that they didn't expect to be there. And when they Google it, they come up with no information about the chemical, or very little information about the chemical. And then I get the phone call from the chemist, and they say, hey, do you know anything about the hazards of this chemical? And she has to say, no, I've never heard of that chemical before, but I'll start doing research on it. So people have this job, which is investigate the chemicals that we have released into the environment, and after the fact, find out about what hazards they have and what implications that has for the people and the animals and the plants that are exposed to those chemicals. I don't think it's true that every chemical that's been released, somebody said, okay, yeah, let's put that out there. A lot of this stuff is inadvertent. And whether it's, companies doing it in secret, or whether it's well-intentioned and it's just reactions, chemical reactions producing chemicals that are not anticipated once they're released into the environment. We don't know necessarily how it got there, but there's definitely a lot of unknown or unexplored chemicals that are all around us. So I guess that's kind of the other side of that coin.
Yeah, yeah. No, you're right. There's a lot that we don't know about chemicals that we use in day-to-day life. So I think that's when I sort of said that we use risk assessment. I think judgments, micro judgments have been made on a balance of risk benefit based on knowledge information that's available at the time on a lot of these things. And then, of course, you have regulatory systems as well, and different regulations that have also driven data generation and improvements of understanding with respect to chemical hazards and risks as well. So, but yeah, we've got to where we have. I guess that's one thing that we can obviously have a conversation about. But then there's also where do we go next, and how do we address this? Because there is so much to potentially still to learn, especially on this topic of persistence. And a big new topic is on transformation products, which you've sort of hinted at there. You put chemicals out into the environment, they as they're being degraded, they will be turned into other chemicals, and that's the nature of the environment.
And not only that, but there's the question of chemical mixtures, right? Because the hazard, when the hazard of a chemical is assessed, it's assessed for that one chemical in isolation, and you model, this one chemical goes into somebody's bloodstream, or it goes into the environment, and what happens to that one chemical. But then you have, flavor and fragrance formulations that have dozens or hundreds of chemicals that are mixed together, and they've never been tested in combination. And we're starting to see evidence that, for example, quaternary ammonium compounds, which are used in cleaning products, on their own, they can be a little bit dangerous. But in combination, they actually get much more dangerous. So if you use a cleaning product that has a few different plots in it, then actually the hazard to you is a lot more significant than could have been predicted by the hazard assessment or the risk assessment that was performed for any of those individual chemicals. So when these chemicals get out into the environment and react and produce new chemicals, and then mix with other chemicals that have produced new chemicals, we literally don't even have a way to assess that. Like, it's not possible for us to assess the impact of that. So how do we decide whether that's acceptable or not? And that's a question I don't know how to answer.
Yeah, it's definitely a thorny issue, the one of mixtures. And to an extent, there's always a kind of potential what if questions. I mean, that's the nature of science and research, we ask the what if questions and then we have to go and investigate them, but we don't have infinite resource to test every single mixture. So we have to try and make decisions as best we can. And yeah, but you're right that mixtures is definitely a hot topic right now, and that's been one of the things that one of the regulatory measures that's being discussed right now is whether we need additional safety factors for our risk assessments to account for these co-exposures. So yeah, it'd be really interesting to see what happens with the update to the REACH regulation on that.
Yeah,
For
I'll be
instance,
very curious to see because I do not know how it's possible to account for the co-exposure. I suppose you'd have to do it on a limited sort of basis, not taking into account environmental reactivity, right?
yeah, yeah. Yeah, yeah, it is a big one to discuss. So I just had a conversation with Andrew Johnson on the podcast, who's a professor at UK Centre of Ecology and Hydrology. He just released a study looking at monitoring data for rivers in England, and essentially using sophisticated modelling, they were able to tease apart the variables that they were measuring that were linking to the macroinvertebrate biodiversity in the rivers. It seemed to show quite interesting insights that the biodiversity within the rivers had increased since the 80s to a place where it was level in the 2000s and since then, but that metals were actually seemingly the thing that was driving a lot of the toxicity, and they weren't seeing kind of wastewater inputs as a source of this toxicity. And that's a completely different way of looking at impacts in the environment and trying to connect them to things that we're putting into the environment and linking it to human activity. And so it is a really complex picture, but if you follow the trail of breadcrumbs from our risk assessment processes in regulation, then it only takes you to one place, which means that we're overlooking mixture effects at the moment.
Yeah, it's a lot of the things that are that I deal with on a daily basis. When you think about them for any length of time, you start to get very, very concerned. So you just kind of have to do the best you can and accept that there's things that aren't going to change immediately, I suppose.
It's we've got to keep moving forward and doing what we can in our own zone, I
Mm.
suppose, our own domain.
Yeah.
Not that we should keep to our domain, but
No, but
we've,
there's this situation of information overload, right?
mm,
We're in a society now where we're bombarded by information, by
yeah,
concerning information from every angle. And if you try to pay attention to all of it, you do end up paralyzed. You end up, basically cowering under your bed because there's so many horrible things that are going on that are more, we have more information about than ever before. So you do, I mean, just by the nature of your human brain being limited in its capacity to understand and to process upsetting information, you do have to limit the things that are within your sphere of influence. So I've been doing some reading about that lately as well, where there's a lot that we can learn from political organizers, really people who are very active and trying to drive political engagement. They talk
mm,
about your sphere of influence, that local, and you can have the most effect in your neighborhood and in your community. And then going further out in your city, you can still have a significant impact. Going further in your state or in your region, your impact starts to be more diluted. And then when it comes to nationwide and continent-wide globally, there's very little that one person can do. The advice is you have a limited amount of energy, try and spend it as much as you can within your sphere of influence and try and affect the things that you can affect. Try to talk to your neighbors about, the impacts of hazardous chemicals or not buying vinyl flooring or what have you. And then when it comes to, posting about it on social media, maybe that's not as important because it's not actually going to drive anybody to change. But I thought that was kind
mm,
of a helpful way to look at it is A, you are allowed to limit what you think about and what you care about on a daily basis because
mm,
if you dive too deep into that pool, you end up never doing anything and never making a difference because you're just infuriated or very sad or traumatized.
mm,
So yeah, I think for the sake of being able to make a difference, it's actually okay to say, I don't have the capacity to think about that right now. I'm going to focus on the thing that I'm equipped to influence, and I'm going to try my hardest to influence that, and I'll set this other thing aside because it will overwhelm me if I look too hard at that. Right. So it's a decision
Mm,
that everybody has to make what feels right for them. But it is, in the information age and the disinformation age that we live in, you
mm.
you have to set boundaries around your capacity to process information.
No, that's really interesting insights there, Anna. And yeah, you're clearly somebody who's thinking a lot about these challenges. And, this isn't just a company for you, it's part of your life's work.
Well, this is true, I think, for most people who are in the green chemistry space. We didn't get there by accident. It's not a normal career path for a chemist still. Unfortunately, it's becoming more normal, it's becoming more mainstream. But if you look, say, 20, 30 years ago, green chemists were considered very strange and kind of like the hippie version of a chemist, and they weren't taken very seriously. And in some
Mm,
areas, they're still not taken seriously. Like in the EU and in the US, acceptance of green chemistry is growing. But in other regions of the world, it's still considered quite a strange thing to be concerned about doing chemistry sustainably. So most of the people who have devoted their careers to green chemistry, you will find, have very strong feelings about sustainability, and they're very passionate about it because they didn't get into that career by accident, right? I actually got into green
yes.
chemistry because I happen to be good at chemistry, but what I care about is sustainability. And so green chemistry is my outlet for how do I make a difference in the world? How do I make the world a better place by using the thing that I happen to be good at, which is chemistry. Whereas most chemists I've found who are in academia, I guess you could call them brown chemists, they're kind of the other way around. They really, really love chemistry and they enjoy doing it. Some of them enjoy being in the lab and mixing things together and seeing what happens. They have kind of that curious nature. And that's fantastic. Like we need those people, but most green chemists are not necessarily there because they think chemistry is cool. They might think chemistry is cool, but they're also very, very deeply
Mm.
passionate about making the world a safer and more sustainable place.
So, Anna, this has been fantastic. I was really happy to speak with you on the podcast as well, given that you're also trying to build something in your own area in green chemistry. So, thank you very much for spending your time to talk us through some of that and to discuss ideas with you. I normally ask my guests a couple of questions. I suspect that we've already covered the big goal that you're working towards in the coming months.
So the training course is one big goal. And then the other one is we're actually going to be launching a software sometime in the next few months that is coming out of a collaboration that we did with Cambridge that was funded by Innovate UK. And it's about polymer solubility. That's how do you dissolve polymers and plastics and materials. But it's actually a hidden bottleneck in sustainable innovation because we need alternative plastics, right? We need packaging. We need these materials that enable us to have a sustainable lifestyle. We need wind turbine blades, and we need lightweight vehicles, and we need drugs to be delivered in our bodies. That's also done with polymers. So there's all of these healthy and sustainable outcomes that are enabled by polymers, but currently we're not doing polymers in a sustainable way because we're making them from petroleum, and usually at end of life we just throw them away. So polymer dissolution is something that would enable not only more sustainable polymers, because we could make new bio-based and biodegradable polymers, but also it would enable polymer recycling for a circular economy, because if you could selectively dissolve the nylon from your gym clothes and then move it to the next vat and then selectively dissolve the lycra, then you can recover all of that and reuse it again. So yeah, polymer dissolution is critical for recycling, for processing, for formulation, for cleaning. And right now we don't have a good way to predict it. So we have this AI-powered software that's built on a huge database that we made ourselves using high throughput automation experiments. And yeah, it's, as far as we know, it's the most accurate software out there for predicting polymer dissolution. Conservatively speaking, it can predict it with 90% accuracy. And we're really hoping that it helps to accelerate the green chemical transition in a very material way. We have the algorithm, we have the data set, we're working on a couple of consultancy projects with our first clients to try and tailor it to their specific use case. And then within the next few months, we'll hopefully be launching the software itself for beta trials where you can put in the structure of a polymer, the name of a polymer, and get predictions about what solvent is going to dissolve it with 90% accuracy. So yeah, that's the other big project. Thank you so much for
Nice.
having me on. And it's been really nice to have this conversation. And regulatory chemistry is something that I'm always adjacent to. And I'm always very, very grateful that there are people who are deep in that space because we need people like you to understand the regulations and push the regulations in a good direction. That's something that I could never do because just the level of focus on the details of the regulation is just, I couldn't do it on a day-to-day basis. So I'm very glad that there are regulatory chemists out there who enjoy doing that and are good at it.
Oh no, thank you, Anna. That's really nice of you. I think as long as we all keep talking, then we should be able to move in a good direction. So thanks very much for coming on. And thanks to everyone who's been listening. Your time is really precious. And so I'm really grateful that you spent it with us. If you've enjoyed this podcast, then please tell your friends and colleagues about it. We've got more conversations like this to follow. This has been Chemical Journeys. Thank you. And thank you very much, Anna.
All right. Thanks so much, Chris. And I'll speak to you soon.